It is time to introduce the next presenter from Leave No Trace. It is absolutely my pleasure to bring on board Ben Lawhon. Ben is a seasoned conservationist and someone who is dedicated to outdoor ethics and environmental education. He joined Leave No Trace in 2001 and has served now serves as its educational director, head of all research, training programs, and outreaches. So Ben, welcome aboard. Glad to have you with us today.
Great, thanks Scott. I appreciate the opportunity. It's nice to see so many familiar names in the participant list. And so today what I'm going to talk to you about is some of the things that we're doing to address impacts currently, given everything that's going on in the world, particularly in light of increased visitation and so forth. So I'm going to start with a few basic concepts. I'm sure all of you are familiar with them, but why Leave No Trace and what is Leave No Trace? Our mission is to teach people how to enjoy the outdoors responsibly. At the end of the day, that's what we are really inspired to do, is to teach everyone who spends time outside to do so in a way that leaves those places as good or perhaps even better than they found them. Why do we even need Leave No Trace? Well, as we all know, Leave No Trace is one of the best ways to minimize impacts in the outdoors. It's a simple framework for making good decisions about leaving less of a trace on the land. When we look at public lands visitation in the US, it's quite obvious that there are more and more of us spending time outside. If you look across the federal land management agencies, we're in the tens to hundreds of millions of annual visits. If you look at the state park system in the US, they have just under 800 million visits a year. There are about 8,000 state park units in the US. And it just demonstrates just the sheer volume of people that are spending time on public lands in the US. And with all those people, there's a great opportunity both to introduce people to the outdoors and also to introduce them to the concept of Leave No Trace. But it also presents an opportunity for a lot of impact to occur, particularly when people are uninformed about how to minimize their impacts. So what's leading to these increases in outdoor recreation that we're seeing?
Picture this, your next trip, Utah, 5 national parks. First, Zion. You're walking, the ground rises, the ground drops, the ground becomes water. Next, Bryce. You're riding a mule. You're riding a mule under giant orange drip castles. You are not dreaming. You will not forget this. On to Capitol Reef. Take the scenic route, the really scenic route. Take a path you've never taken and see the stars for the first time. Now for Canyonlands. You're riding a bike. You're riding a bike on Mars. Now you're riding the rapids. Class 2, Class 3, Class 4, Classic. Arches, 5:32 a.m. Some things are worth racing the sunrise for. The horizon lightens. You round the corner. Whoa. This is Life Elevated. The Mighty 5. 5 iconic parks, 1 epic experience. Plan your trip at visitutah.com.
So some of you may have seen that video. This was a campaign that was launched by the tourism entities in Utah. And it was so successful that you end up with headlines like this in the Wall Street Journal: Tourists heeding Utah's Mighty 5 campaign, overpower Moab. So that video is so inspirational. It makes people want to go see those 5 incredible national parks. And this is the kind of thing that, while getting people in the outdoors, there until now has really not been a stewardship message with so much of the promotion of public lands. And so we see a lot of people that want to go to these places, but they are either overrunning communities that are on the borders of these parks, or while they're in the parks, they don't know how to minimize their impacts. This is a shot from Zion National Park. This is a pretty common scene, certainly pre-COVID, but we're seeing just such significant increases in visitation that you've got trails that historically you might not have seen too many people on. And then you get a situation like this where it's literally, one person after the next that want to go see these amazing sites. Here's another shot from Zion. This is the Virgin River Narrows. And so this is just indicative of this overall increase in visitation to our parks and protected areas. If you take a look at this is interesting. In terms of attendance for the 5 national parks that were associated with that campaign, you can look at the visitation levels, say dating back to 2010, maybe 2008. If you look at the inflection point of where the Mighty 5 campaign started and look at the growth over that 4-year period in visitation, it's pretty stunning when you look at how significant one ad campaign can do towards driving people to go see these parks. And again, we want people to visit these, but the impact that's being left is what's really causing some significant issues, in this case, the National Park Service. There's also a big role that social media is playing in all this, and has been for a couple of years. I'm sure many of you are aware of the social media guidance that we, the center, have put out in response to this. But we see more and more headlines like this here. Is geotagging on Instagram ruining natural wonders? Some say yes. If you look at the line right under the photograph, it says, "Sorry, Instagrammers, you are ruining Wyoming." Well, I don't know if that's entirely the case, but it certainly, there are numerous instances where people learn about a place on social media, they don't receive any information about leaving no trace in these places, and it's a missed opportunity. And so we see the effects of that on the ground. Here's another one that is a waterfall in New York State. And this Catterskill Falls, there have been at least now 5 fatalities at this waterfall from people getting too close to the edge who wanted to get the great photograph of this waterfall. And this just goes to show that sometimes these issues we're dealing with really do have certainly a health and safety component. This is a specific example where people really just want to get a great shot, but they're not really taking into consideration their own personal safety. There are other factors that are driving visitation of public lands. There have been so many initiatives to get kids outdoors for health benefits, for mental health benefits, exercise, to introduce kids to the outdoors. These are all good things. And the National Park Service, for example, has made it possible for every 4th grade kid in the US to get a full National Parks Pass for their family. This is a good thing, but again, we're dealing with significant increased visitation as a result. There are some other factors that are really driving visitation to public lands. One is there's been continued economic expansion since the recession. People have more disposable income, and they are willing to travel to either local or regional parks and protected areas because of that additional disposable income. We've also seen a significant increase in international visitation to US parks and protected areas. 30% of international travelers that come to the US visit a national park, which is pretty remarkable when you think 1/3 of all the people that are coming to this country to vacation or what have you go to one of our national parks. Over the last couple of years, we've also had some very high profile things like the 100th anniversary of the National Park System, which is in 2016. We had just recently the 50th anniversary of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and the National Trail System Act. And both of those opportunities really promoted these parks, these wild and scenic rivers and trails for people to enjoy. We've also seen what the people in the tourism industry oftentimes refer to as this hub and spoke approach in terms of availability of air travel and rental cars. And it's this idea that, you can be at an airport and get on a plane, and 2 to 3 hours later, you arrive at another major airport with the availability to grab a car, and you can be in a national park in a matter of minutes in some cases, hours in some cases, but just the increased availability of travel and really more of this sort of DIY approach, where these new mobile technologies that we have are enabling people to basically create their own itineraries that in years past took a little more research. You had to read books, you had to talk to people. A lot of these things are being pushed because of the mobile technology that is available. And so, as you're all aware, Leave No Trace is a spectrum. On one end, we have very significant impacts to the landscape. And on the other end, we have potentially very few, maybe even none. And what our organizational goal has been for the last many years is just to help people find their place on this spectrum. Each action that someone does that minimizes impact has a benefit to the landscape. And the accumulation of all these good actions for the landscape is how we really win. And that's what we're trying to do, is just help people understand those simple things they can do. So if they go out for a hike and they stick to the trail, great, you left no trace. If the next day they go out, they stick to trails and they pick up after their dog, hey, that's 2 things you've done that are helping our parks and protected areas. So the impacts from recreation, and there are lots of them. And one of the challenges is that people don't always understand the impacts they don't always understand the consequences. This shot here, many of you may have seen this. It's fascinating to me because this is totally a human problem here. That's the door to the bear locker that was not secured. And so now this bear, who's clearly been tagged twice, is rifling through this plastic tub full of food. And this is how we lead to, food attraction and food conditioned bears who ultimately the bear loses in this situation. This is really unfortunate because this was totally avoidable here. We're also seeing impacts from things like campfires. I mean, I'm sure many of you are aware of the horrific fire season we had here in the West this year. Certainly Colorado, the 2 largest wildfires in state history occurred this year. And not only we did get scenes like this here where you have a fire ring full of trash and there's obvious impact that's, again, largely avoidable, we could have much more large-scale landscape consequences as a result of this type of fire impact. We're also seeing something that's a little newer. It's a social media phenomenon, and this started about 3 or 4 years ago, selfies with wildlife. The woman on the left here, that's a grizzly bear. And she's taking a selfie with a grizzly bear in the background for her Instagram feed, I presume. And this guy on the right is obviously very close to a bison. And, the challenge that we have is oftentimes these people just want to get that great shot, but they don't really understand the consequences of their actions, nor do they take into account the personal safety issues. And then you've got this copycat effect. So if you get on the internet and search wildlife selfie, you will get more photos than you can even imagine of people engaging in these types of behavior, and in many cases with dangerous wildlife. And so once we start to normalize this behavior, more and more people want to do it, and it can become a real problem very quickly. Another impact that we see often is this is a trail that's here in Boulder, on this Boulder open space and mountain parks. And this was a couple of years ago in the spring. It's a hike that I did regularly. And in March, the original trail tread was about 18 to 24 inches wide. And by the end of May, this is what the trail looked like. It had widened to 50 feet because people were unprepared, underprepared, didn't have what they needed to stick to that trail. And so we end up with a situation like this that is, creates erosion. It creates obviously trampling effect. There's also a cost associated with this. Land managers have to then spend money to fix these sorts of problems, which again, completely avoidable if people can stick to trails. Another impact we're seeing is we work in more and more urban parks. This is a shot from a park in San Francisco, Mission Dolores Park. It's a 16-acre essentially park in the city. And this is the garbage that accumulates on a normal Saturday. This is not a festival. There's nothing going on. There's no concert. This is just late Saturday afternoon. And this is all the garbage that people have brought into this park and then are ostensibly leaving there, trying to get it in the trash cans. But we get this accumulation of waste then folks have to deal with. When people leave the park, there are local wildlife in the area. They can get into this trash. So it's, again, understanding how these impacts occur and what the consequences really are. As Dana mentioned, we are science-based and we are data-driven in our approach. Largely, the Leave No Trace principles and the specific recommendations are built on much of the work of Jeff Marion and other recreation ecologists that help us understand how impacts are created and how they can be minimized or mitigated, and also looks at the managerial implications of those impacts. For about the last decade, we've really been focusing organizationally on the social science side of Leave No Trace, because what we need to do is figure out how can we better influence the decisions that people make in the outdoors. It's one thing to know what to do. It's a whole other animal to actually get people to do things like pack out their own human waste or pack out their trash or their pet waste. And so the scientific portion of our portfolio of work is incredibly important for us in terms of making sure that Leave No Trace education, outreach, and training is effective at influencing those decisions people make in the outdoors. So a number of years ago, there was a couple of scientists that posited this relationship between recreation impact and recreational use. And the idea is that as recreational use increases, recreational impact also increases. And what we are trying to do is help change the sort of the style of this graph so that as recreational use increases, we'd love to get to a point where we don't necessarily see a whole lot of increased recreational impacts. Think if everyone were able to put Leave No Trace into action, I would argue we would see less impacts on the landscape, even though there are more and more of us spending time out there. And so when we talk about influencing behavior and influencing decisions that people make, we look at the types of problems that we typically see on public lands. You see illegal actions, you see careless actions, unskilled, uninformed, and unavoidable. And if you look at the potential effectiveness of education in reducing these types of problematic actions, we see that we can be very effective when we're dealing with careless actions, with unskilled actions, and with uninformed actions. That's where we at Leave No Trace really feel like our work lives, is in this world of careless, unskilled, uninformed, because we can educate people, give them the tools they need, give them the techniques they need, give them the inspiration they need to put these practices into action so that we're minimizing behavior. So when we look at how we can be most effective, we really target these folks that just need information. They need to be informed. They need to learn the skills. And when we think about any recreational experience, there's typically 5 steps to any recreational experience. So you've got the anticipation, you're planning for the outing, you're looking at maps, you've gone to REI, you're getting your gear together, you're talking to people online or talking to your friends about trips they've done to this place or this location. Then you've got the travel to, so you're in your car, you're on a plane, you're in a train, you're in a bike, however you're getting there. And then you're on site, you're involved, you're immersed in the experience. And then you got the travel back. You've got the blisters, you got the bug bites, you got the t-shirt, you got the patch, and you're headed home. And then the 5th one is this reflection phase. And that could be blogging or posting pictures to social media, any of these types of things where you're sort of reliving the trip, if you will. Well, generally speaking, we reach most people with Leave No Trace information when they're on site. And that's not a bad thing. The challenge is that it's probably too late. If they show up and they're unprepared and we reach them with a trailhead signage, with the trailhead sign, and they don't have what they need, they're probably going to continue on with that outing. And that presents a challenge. We may influence the decisions they make for the next time, but on this particular outing, it may not work. Where we'd like to reach people is in the anticipation phase. That's why the first principle is plan ahead and prepare. And so we're actively working with a variety of different entities and different types of mechanisms and channels to reach people in that trip planning phase, because it is so critical in terms of minimizing impacts. So how do we reach people? There are obviously a variety of things that we do. We've jokingly said for a long time that we don't have a silver bullet, but we do have silver buckshot. And so we're working with our land management partners and various media outlets through volunteers and signage and word of mouth and training and all the rest of these things that are on here. We have found that this type of approach is really what it takes. It's a very comprehensive approach because it's challenging to know exactly where people are coming from. And so we need to do everything that we can to reach as many people as we can with good information about enjoying the outdoors responsibly. So what does success look like? If Leave No Trace is successful, what does that actually look like? So if our ultimate goal is to influence the decisions that people are making in the outdoors regarding their impacts, success looks like a decrease in the biophysical and social impacts to the landscape and to other people. It also looks like a decrease in maintenance needs. If our federal and state land management agencies didn't have to put as much money into rehabilitation and trail work and fixing amenities and infrastructure repair and that sort of thing, with that money could be used for other things in parks and protected areas. So we potentially could see a decrease in those maintenance needs. We could also see an improvement in resource and social conditions, which would be amazing to see. Things are actually improving. Trails are not getting wider. We're seeing fewer campfire scars. People are getting along. We're having less user conflict on trails and on waterways. And the last one is we might see an increase in visitor satisfaction. And you might say, well, why is that important? The reason that's important is when people have a good time in the outdoors, they're more likely to come back. They're more likely to support a place. They're more likely to help and assist and volunteer and then more likely to take care of a place. And so these would be some tremendous success metrics for us. And some of these we're actually starting to see, despite the fact that there are more and more people spending time outside literally every single year. So does Leave No Trace work? Is there any evidence? I think probably many of you in the audience would say, yeah, anecdotally, sure, it works. Do we have any empirical evidence? There are 3 studies that I'm going to quickly profile that really demonstrate the effectiveness of Leave No Trace, and it does work. This was a study done by Jeff Marion, Bob Dvorak, and Bob Manning, and they were specifically looking at wildlife feeding in parks and looking at the effectiveness of various educational interventions to minimize wildlife food attraction behaviors. And essentially the upshot of this study was that there were significant improvements documented under the treatment conditions. So when people got a specific message about not feeding wildlife, it actually led to reductions in wildlife feeding. Similarly, the Leave No Trace focused messaging was effective at influencing the behavior in park visitors. So we're moving beyond the anecdotal and saying, look, when we give people good Leave No Trace information, we can actually influence their behavior in situ, in parks and protected areas. Another study, this was a study that we did in 2015, looking at the efficacy of our youth education in terms of could we influence the decisions that kids make in the outdoors? And specifically the focus of this was the fourth principle, leave what you find. We were curious to know if fifth graders, if they had a Leave No Trace lesson about leave what you find, would they in fact be more likely to leave natural, historic, or cultural objects they may find in the outdoors behind? And this was set up as a quasi-experimental design study. We did it with an outdoor school in Pennsylvania. And essentially we had basically a 6-week outdoor school that had a new group of 80 to 100 fifth graders each week for 6 weeks. And so week 1 was a treatment week. Every kid got a 20 to 30 minute Leave No Trace lesson on leave what you find. The second week, none of the kids got the lesson. Third week, everybody got the lesson, so on and so forth. And what we actually found in this study was that when these kids were presented the opportunity, a sort of a serendipitous opportunity to find an arrowhead, a trilobite fossil, or a piece of pyrite, fool's gold, we actually observed that the kids who had been through the Leave No Trace lesson were more likely, statistically more likely to leave those natural, historic, or cultural objects behind than the kids who did not have a Leave No Trace lesson. And so this was a fascinating study. These kids, if you want to read about this, you can download the study from our website, but it was just amazing to see that we could influence kids with a 20-minute lesson that was delivered by a camp counselor who had about 2 hours of training in Leave No Trace. So we're not talking about years of education, a master's in elementary education. We're talking about quick lessons on Leave No Trace, and it made a direct impact. And the last study is the one Jeff just mentioned in his presentation, and it's excellent to see this study in publication. It literally just came out this week, as Jeff said. And this one is one of the most fascinating because it showed that Leave No Trace is effective at changing resource conditions. So the Leave No Trace educational interventions in this study decreased impacts. The interventions also improved the resource conditions, and Leave No Trace significantly reduced litter, tree damage, and surface disposal of human waste. These are the types of studies that we at the center would like to see more of, and are encouraging more of these types of studies, to have control treatment type studies where we can actually measure the effectiveness of Leave No Trace in terms of changing conditions on the ground. I also want to walk you through a few case studies because there is a lot of anecdotal evidence that Leave No Trace does work and does make a difference. Some of you may recognize this location here. This is Marcy Dam. It's in the Adirondacks. It's in the most heavily used section of the Adirondacks, known as the High Peaks. And this is just sort of a normal Saturday morning. There are, we passed hundreds of people on the trail getting to this location, and we've done a lot of work in the Adirondacks. But this is a specific area where we're hoping that Leave No Trace will be implemented in a much more robust way to make a difference. But let me show you a few areas where we already have made a difference. The Maroon Bell Snowmass Wilderness. It's on the White River National Forest here in Colorado, and there's a very popular hot spring known as Conundrum Hot Springs. And it's about a 9-mile hike into the wilderness, but as you can see, there are a lot of people willing to make this hike. It's had a number of problems over the years, from water quality issues to significant human waste issues with bears, camping, trampling impacts, hiking and trampling impacts, crowding, and all these sorts of things. And we have worked with the U.S. Forest Service on the White River to implement Leave No Trace. And what they've told us is that Leave No Trace is contributing to decreased impacts at Conundrum Hot Springs as part of a comprehensive management strategy. Leave No Trace is integral to this effort. So the managers are actually seeing a reduction in impacts because they have stepped up their Leave No Trace outreach and education to visitors in such a robust way. Another site is the San Juan Islands in Washington State. This is a mix of different land management types: Bureau of Land Management, National Park Service, local and county governments. And the San Juan Islands host a variety of different recreation, from marine wildlife watching to hiking, sea kayaking, numerous water-based activities and that sort of thing. And yet they are seeing a lot of impacts. And the San Juan Islands, within the last 4 or 5 years, have really implemented a comprehensive Leave No Trace strategy to educate both residents and visitors. And what they've said is Leave No Trace is 100% making a difference in San Juan Islands recreation. Over the past 2 years, we've utilized multiple forms of outreach and education. Impacts are definitely decreasing. Another area, Alabama State Parks, CHEAHA State Park in Alabama. This is a site where we've done a lot of work. We've had some great champions in the state of Alabama. Charlie Thorpe, our state advocates there, Skip and Rob Pinkston and others have done tremendous work, and with the state park staff. And one of the big issues at this state park was trash and litter. And they had a very focused Leave No Trace campaign on that. And they have indicated that there's a positive impact related to Leave No Trace and CHEAHA. One of the easiest metrics is the amount of trash in the park. It has greatly decreased as the Leave No Trace message has increased throughout the park. Another area, New York State. This is managed by the New York Department of Environmental Conservation. This is an area called PEEKAMOOSE Blue Hole. Beautiful swimming hole, very heavily used. Lots and lots of impacts. Water quality issues, human waste, conflicts, all sorts of different things. Trampling effects, vegetative impacts and so forth. And we have had a very comprehensive effort of working with the folks in New York with the DEC to help address some of these impacts. And they've reported, yes, Leave No Trace has been utilized as a foundational building block for the Catskill Steward Program and has helped change the culture in this location to be more respectful. So not only are we informing people about skills and techniques, but we're really starting to shift that culture so that people who visit these places do have more respect for these places and ultimately want to take care of them. The last location I'll show you is we've been working for a number of years in Portland, the city of Portland, Oregon, with Portland Parks and Rec. Portland manages the largest municipal park in the country. It's called Forest Park. It's 5,100 acres. And this is a shot of Forest Park. And they have had a variety of issues there, many of which you might suspect with a large urban population, but things like dogs and dogs off leash and pet waste have been real issues for them in terms of wildlife impacts, water quality impacts, impacts on other visitors. And so they really launched a very concerted effort with Leave No Trace to tackle these dog issues. And one of the things that they have found is that Leave No Trace has helped improve our dog off leash model in both natural areas and urban parks. It's been a meaningful common denominator in collaborating with community agencies. So Leave No Trace has been this convening force in many ways, which is an amazing thing to see that a skills and ethics program for responsible enjoyment of the outdoors can serve as a convening entity for bringing different types of groups together to protect a place. So Dana mentioned previously our research. I've talked about it, but what I want to give you now is just an overview of the types of research that we're doing that are helping us inform our work nationally. We have done a variety of studies over the last decade, but we're looking at things like visitor attitudes towards Leave No Trace. If you look at the psychological literature on how we can influence behavior, attitudes are one of the key influences on behavior. And so when we understand attitudes, we can then target those. We can find the leverage points for effective education. So this is a study that was done looking at Leave No Trace behaviors in national parks and how national park visitors felt about Leave No Trace. And one of the things that we found out of this study, and though it's been done, it was 9 years ago, it's still a very salient finding, is that we found that people were more likely to put Leave No Trace into action in the future if we could tell them why it was important in terms of minimizing impacts. People need to understand the why. And intuitively, I would say everyone probably already understands and knows that, but we actually had some data that finally said, we need to tell people how Leave No Trace is effective at minimizing impacts. They need to understand the why. And when they understand the why, generally speaking, there is a stronger intention to put that into action. We also look at similar types of study in state parks. I mentioned there are 8,000 state parks in the US. The visitation is almost 800 million a year. And so we need to understand state park visitor attitudes about Leave No Trace and where those influence points might be and those leverage points might be for messaging. And similarly, in this study, we found that concept of why, telling people why Leave No Trace is effective at minimizing impacts, was a very salient part of what is a comprehensive messaging strategy for state park entities. We also look at specific user types. So in this case, this is a study we did in Rocky Mountain National Park on bouldering and looking at boulderers' attitudes and their specific beliefs about Leave No Trace. This was the first study of its kind in any national park unit. Bouldering had really, by this 2015, had significantly increased in popularity. About 2/3 of rock climbers in the US consider themselves boulderers. And so one of the issues that Rocky was facing is the park is about 97% federally designated wilderness. And they were having so many issues related to bouldering because what we found is that so many newer boulders have learned how to climb in indoor rock climbing gyms, and they're very skilled, but when they go outside, they don't know what to do about their human waste. They don't really understand about minimizing site-specific impacts, at the base of boulders where they're climbing. And so this study was fascinating in that when we started working with the Park Service, they said they would be happy with a sample of 75 boulders in our study. And we had 32 sampling periods, and we ended up with 225 participants in the study, which far exceeded the Park Service, not only their desire, but it helped them understand how much more prevalent this activity was in the park. But we continue to look at specific user attitudes, specific types of people, because we can create different messaging to really resonate with a group. We also look at specific behaviors of interest. This is a study we did with City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks, where we looked at how we could potentially minimize the use of undesignated trails through either messaging or direct management actions like fencing, for example. And what was interesting in this study is we looked at 20 different junctions of designated and undesignated trails on the system. And we employed a methodology where we would actually have unobtrusive observers sort of hidden in the woods that could see these trail junctions. And we would watch what hikers did as they encountered either an educational sign about not taking the undesignated trail, or they encountered a physical barrier, in some cases a physical barrier with a sign. And then as those people would interact with the treatment, they would continue down the trail and they would be intercepted by a surveyor who would offer them a survey. And then that allowed us to look at their reported behavior. We asked them what they did, and then we also observed what they did. So we were able to look at the intersection of that observed and reported behavior. And that methodology really helps you better understand how we can craft messaging or use more direct management options to minimize the use of undesignated trails. And to put this in perspective, the City of Boulder Open Space and Mountain Parks, it's about 48,000 acres of land. They have 150 miles of designated trails, and there are another 150 miles of undesignated visitor-created trails. So almost double their system in trails that the agency never created. So it's a significant problem there. It's a significant problem in a lot of places. We're also looking at things, this is another behavior of interest. We're looking at, in this case, proper disposal of pet waste. This was a study where we wanted to have an observational component to see what people did at trailheads with their pet waste, but also have a survey component. And we found that there was relatively high compliance with pet waste disposal, but it also identified some potential opportunities for better messaging to pet owners about why they need to properly dispose of their waste. And there were some pretty significant implications that came out of this in terms of infrastructure and placement of infrastructure and that sort of thing. But one of the biggest findings was that there are great opportunities to specifically message to people in a different way about why they need to dispose their pet waste. When we got to 2018, we had used enough of the same types of variables across a variety of different park and protected area types that we were able to do an analysis that looked at visitors' views of Leave No Trace on a variety of public lands. We looked at people in national parks, we looked at people in national forests, and we looked at people in 3 different state parks to determine what people's views were across these different types of park entities. And what we found is they're pretty uniform feelings about Leave No Trace, and that it's effective, that it works, that it does minimize impacts, that people do think it's a good thing to do. And people also indicated that they were willing to put Leave No Trace into action in many cases, provided they knew what needed to be done. And so the big upshot of this was that we can use more of a uniform approach across park and protected area types with Leave No Trace and still be effective, as opposed to having to tailor each program for each specific park. You know, in a state like Colorado, where we have over 30 state parks, if we had to do 30 different Leave No Trace programs, very quickly the agency would run out of money, they'd run out of staffing, they'd probably run out of the support for that sort of thing. And so we can use more of a uniform approach. That is a particularly useful finding for today's cash-strapped agencies who are looking for ways to minimize impacts, but be mindful of the financial resources they have and the staffing resources. So that was a great finding of this particular study, but this gives you a sense of the types of things that we're looking at. Another study in 2018, we specifically did a study in national parks looking at campgrounds and trash and waste behavior in campgrounds and national parks. Campgrounds are the single largest source of visitor-generated waste in national parks. There are over 100 million pounds of trash generated in national parks every year in the US. And that's through park operations and visitors and concessions and others, but doesn't quite include every bit of waste that comes out of park, but that's one of the best numbers that we have. And the largest source of visitor-generated waste is campgrounds. So we really wanted to look at campers and their use of recycling and waste infrastructure in campgrounds and get a better understanding of their attitudes and their behaviors regarding this. We also, in this same study, looked at park staff and concession staff in parks. And this study was done in 3 national parks: Yosemite, Grand Teton, and Denali National Parks. And what we found is that campground visitors, so campers, were very much aligned with the idea of properly disposing of their waste in campgrounds and properly sorting their recyclables and making sure that their waste didn't affect wildlife. Similarly, we found that National Park Service employees and park concession employees were also very aligned with the idea of properly disposing of their waste in parks. One of the interesting findings was we found that concession employees were even more aligned with this idea of reducing waste in parks than National Park Service employees were. And there were some statistically significant differences there. And so there's some interesting findings in terms of how can we train park staff? How can we train concession staff about these issues? And what best practices can we share to ensure that park staff, concession staff are also setting good examples for park visitors? The last study that I want to talk about is we did 3 years of work leading up to this study here. And essentially, I mentioned those 3 national parks. There was an effort called the Zero Landfill Initiative that was launched in 2016, again, in Yosemite, the Tetons, and Denali National Park. We started doing research in 2017, looked at visitors, just general front country visitors. 2018, we looked at campgrounds. And in 2019, we actually took our findings and created data-driven messaging and did a quasi-experimental design where we deployed these messages in the parks, and we would observe the infrastructure that had specific messaging on it, and we would then survey those individuals once we captured the observational data. So someone would encounter a trash can or recycle bin, we would have an observer that would capture their behavior at the bin, and then we would survey those same individuals. So this is a similar methodology that we've used in past studies. And what was really interesting in this is that we were able to actually change behavior on site when we had our treatments deployed. And these looked like National Park Service signs. They were magnetic in most cases, but they had the Park Service arrowhead. It was very official looking. And so we between control and treatment, we actually made a difference under those treatment conditions in terms of garnering better disposal, better sorting of recycling materials, people putting the right things in trash and the right things in recycling. And so it's a fascinating study in terms of knowing that data-driven messages actually do work to change and influence behavior. So I wanted to circle back to social media. There's no question that social media is driving visitation to our public lands. Impacts are occurring as a result of social media in some cases. Most of the lands and the land management agencies that we work with, from federal to state to local, are feeling the pressure of social media, but there's very limited empirical data on the role that social media is playing in terms of driving people to the landscape. So you can see this Instagram shot over here from Glacier National Park, and it's a hidden lake overlooking Glacier National Park. Here's what it looks like on Instagram on the left, and then on the right, this is the reality. And so they actually say, pack your patience and plan ahead. And so this just gives you a sense of, people want to see these iconic destinations they see on social media, but that may or may not be what they actually get when they arrive. And so we last year worked with some academic colleagues to publish a proposed social media research agenda to look at some of these issues to really better understand the role that social media plays in the outdoors and driving people to the outdoors. And so we, this year, have been exploring numerous opportunities to look at the role of social media. So I would say stay tuned for that. We will likely be engaging in some of that work in 2021. So studies that we're either working on this year or that are flowing into next year, to give you a sense of the types of things we're working on. Dana mentioned it in her presentation. In March of this year, we wanted to conduct this very rapid assessment of outdoor recreation trends during the coronavirus pandemic. And so we worked with one of our academic partners, Penn State University, to launch a study that would go over a 9-week time frame. And we leveraged the Leave No Trace database for study participants. So it was essentially a convenient sample that we utilized. But we had almost 3,000 participants in the study, and we essentially sent out a survey that was to be done in 48 hours. We wanted to have a very tight timestamp on these surveys. And then we did this 2 more times over this 9-week period. And we were able to paint a picture of what the trends look like. So in the first assessment, what we saw was people were sticking closer to home. They were using recreational amenities that were closer to home, neighborhood streets, sidewalks, trails in their neighborhoods or near their neighborhoods or near their homes. We also saw people were unwilling to travel in any great distances from home. People were staying out of the backcountry in many cases. And we also saw that urban residents were most impacted by this because of lockdowns and stay-at-home orders and that sort of thing. These are people who had minimal access to the outdoors to begin with, and then you throw a pandemic on top of that, and it really curtailed that. What we saw by the third phase of this was that people were really starting to sort of get back to their normal dosage of recreation. They were starting to spend more time outside, venture a little further from home. They were largely basing their decisions on outdoor recreation on 2 primary things. One is good information from trusted health sources like the CDC or the World Health Organization or their local county or state health departments. But they were also looking to the land management community for guidance on appropriate visitation and recreation during COVID. And one of the most interesting things that, in my opinion, that came out of this was in phase 2 of this study, we actually saw where respondents were indicating they wanted limits on the number of people that could be in a park or protected area. And in my experience, we don't see very often where outdoor recreationists ask for limitations on their recreation freedom. And this is one instance where people indicated they felt like they wanted land management agencies to minimize the number of people so that they could protect themselves, stay healthy, and so forth. So these results are on our website. There's a report from each phase of the study. We also have 1 journal article that's already been published and 2 that are in press right now. And so lots of information on this study. I will put a link in the chat box. You can take a look at that. We're also looking right now, we just finished data collection on a study looking at attitudes, perceptions, and behaviors related to food storage practices on the Appalachian Trail. There have been a number of issues in the past couple of years with bears obtaining human foods on the AT, and the Appalachian Trail Conservancy is very interested in understanding hikers' attitudes and perceptions, behaviors, and behavioral intentions related to storing their food, specifically using things like bear canisters. And so we launched this study in early October. We had about 1,800 participants in the study, and we just have gotten through the first couple of cuts of data, but we anticipate having a technical report available on this before Christmas. And so we're really interested again in looking at this is a specific type of user, but the implications could be, far and wide, given that we're seeing more issues with humans and bears and conflict in a lot of parks and protected areas, and a lot of that's related to food storage practices. We're also engaged in a study currently on this notion of environmentally responsible behavior, ERB, and the intersection of Leave No Trace. As Dana mentioned, we thought for a long time that if you are trained in Leave No Trace or you are a Leave No Trace supporter or what have you, that you probably engage in environmentally responsible behavior at home. You recycle, you turn off lights when you leave the room, you grow your own food, you take alternative transportation, these sorts of things. And so we really wanted to look at potential relationships between ERB and Leave No Trace. And the idea is that for most people, Leave No Trace probably doesn't stop at the park boundary. You take this ethic home with you. And for people who have this ethic at home but don't yet understand how they can put that into action in parks and protected areas, this study might help us figure out how to bridge that gap so that we can expand that aperture and that we could start to encourage people to, take these behaviors to the park. And if you're doing it in the park, make sure you're taking it home. So we're really interested in this, a fascinating study. We do have a sample of Leave No Trace trainers, master educators, and members, but we also have a nationally representative sample that is census matched for those 4 criteria of age, race, income, and gender. And so we're going to be able to look at a whole variety of Leave No Trace variables in a nationally representative sample, which is the first time we've had the opportunity to do that. And we can compare that with people who are engaged with Leave No Trace in some level. And the last study that we're working on right now is an experimental design study that's going to be in Grand Teton National Park. A lot of problems in the Tetons with people getting too close to bison. And the Park Service is very interested in understanding how close is too close and what are people's perceptions of this. And so we're working right now on the details in terms of how to set up this experimental design with safe distances for wildlife viewing. And so again, it gives you a sense of the types of things we're interested in terms of the psychology of recreationists and people who spend time in the outdoors. And again, looking for those leverage points to make sure that what we're doing is as effective as it can be. So how is all this research informing curriculum? The big thing here is we're taking our findings and we're disseminating them far and wide. So for example, the findings of you got to tell people why. This is from Grand Canyon National Park. We worked with their recreation planners. They were having issues with rim to rim use, north rim to south rim to north rim. And one of the big issues for them was wanting a better way to resonate with rim to rim users in a quick fashion. So they created a whole program on trail courtesy practices that leave no trace. And so, when they say restrooms are available on the trails, use them, you can see right there, they leave at the why. Why? Proper disposal of human waste prevents water pollution, etc. They have a whole program that leads with this why. So it's less about the what and the how, but we're really getting to the why. Also, you can see we've taken the bouldering study that I referenced. We used our findings from that bouldering study to directly influence this ethics card here on bouldering. We took some of the findings that were the most salient and we embedded them in this curriculum. Another piece was the youth study that I mentioned. We took some of those findings and that helped inform things like Bigfoot's Playbook. So we're not just doing this research just to have a technical report or a published journal article. We're really doing it for the applied benefits to the Leave No Trace program. So strategies that are making a difference. What are the things that are working? Well, these are some really high level strategies and tactics that are being used nationally and very successfully to minimize and address recreation related impacts. So one of the things that we see a big lack in, and I think Jeff, Marion, and others would echo this sentiment, is that we're not seeing enough documentation of baseline conditions. Oftentimes land managers don't know their starting point. They know they have problems, but they don't understand the full scope of it. So we're advocating monitoring of baseline conditions, and that's helping to define the metrics of success. We're using citizen science in many places to capture these baseline metrics, because that can help you see if things are moving in the right direction or if you need to correct course and move in a different direction. We're also utilizing this data-driven approach to educating outdoor enthusiasts. When we know what people's specific attitudes and beliefs and perceptions are, that can help us create more effective educational output to specifically address those attitudes or those perceptions or those beliefs to better influence the decisions that people are making in the outdoors, to make our educational output more effective. We also are found that an engaging, cohesive management strategy is really important. Whether it's social media, websites, signage, maps, guidebooks, and all the rest, having that cohesive, engaging strategy is critical, rather than just sort of one-off messaging here and there. And the last is we're really finding tremendous value in formal partnerships with state and regional tourism entities. Tourism sends so many people to the outdoors, and that's a good thing. But when tourism can really grasp the Leave No Trace concepts and help promote Leave No Trace to all the people that they're able to reach through their various mechanisms, that's when we start to really see some significant benefits, because these people will go visit outdoor spaces and hopefully they'll be informed about how to do so in a responsible way. So I mentioned citizen science. We're using the platform sitsci.org. It's, as Dana mentioned, we have a tailored app for Leave No Trace through SitSci. SitSci is a national citizen science platform. It was started at Colorado State University through a National Science Foundation grant. We basically got in on the ground floor with this one, and we're rolling out a number of citizen science projects for 2021. But it's great to see this type of engagement. It can get volunteers excited, and it's the type of thing where people can collect data when they're just out on a hike. They don't necessarily have to go out to collect data. It can just be done while they're spending time outside already. And it's a way for us to really engage with people and get them to better understand parks and protected areas and their connection and their role in protecting those places. I also mentioned the data-driven messages. This is one of the signs from the study that I mentioned that we did regarding trash and recycling. And so, you know, this was the message that we found. This was this moral norms focused message, essentially saying you have the power to help or harm the health of this park. And these are the types of things that we're finding, these succinct messages that are based off data about people's attitudes can make a difference in a park or protected area in terms of people's behavior. The messaging strategy, this is an example of some collateral that was created through our partnership with the Colorado Tourism Office, and they've come up with this pretty slick campaign, Are You Colo Ready? And this thing has gone so far and so wide because people love this icons, they love the graphic, it is all leave no trace. But we're finding that this type of really slick sort of messaging strategy really speaks to a lot of people in ways that we have been unable to do in the past in some ways. And so this kind of more comprehensive, really well-designed, well thought out, succinct messaging is really being effective. And the last one I'll just show you is this model for tourism. We're seeing where you got the tourism industry, you also have the outdoor industry, and then we have our public land management agencies. And right there in the middle of all this is Leave No Trace. And so we're really starting to connect these dots, given our longstanding outdoor industry partnerships, our 25 plus years of public land partnerships, and now this emerging tourism partnerships we're seeing nationally. And we really feel strongly that this is going to be such a win for not only outdoor enthusiasts, but also for public lands. So some final thoughts. There are more and more of us trying to enjoy a finite space. I mean, I say this often. I think my colleagues are probably tired of hearing me say it, but we're always making more people, but we're not making more land. We are all trying to enjoy the same finite space. And as there are more and more of us, it's going to become more and more of a challenge. I would argue that most of the impacts that we're seeing in parks and protected areas are the result of just people being uninformed. They're ignorant of what to do in order to minimize their impacts. It's not malicious intent. I just don't think that people wake up and the first thought in their head is, how can I harm the earth today? I think most people, when they understand what the best thing to do is in terms of minimizing impacts, they'll probably do it. And so we just need to make sure that we're reaching as many people as we can. It's going to take all of us to educate visitors to public lands. And thank goodness for the Scouts and the great work that has been done through Scouting in terms of reaching youth, as well as adult leaders, but really helping create that next generation of stewards. And as an Eagle Scout from 1998, I can tell you that Scouts was extremely influential, not only in my personal life, but obviously in my professional life. And so it's going to take all of us to help people understand that we've only got one planet and we've got to all take care of that together. The other thing I'll say is it's not about yesterday, it's about tomorrow. Let's not get hung up on things that have occurred in the past. We can learn from those things, but we really got to be focusing on, and certainly our youth, is what are you going to do tomorrow that's different than what you did today in terms of taking care of the outdoor spaces that you care about, that you love. And the last thing I'll say is Leave No Trace, we're not about perfection. Yes, if everyone could do all 7 principles and hit every single bullet point on every ethics card every time they're outside, that would certainly be wonderful. I don't think that's very realistic. We're about action. We want everybody, if everybody just did one thing to minimize their impact today in the outdoors, that would be tremendous. And then if tomorrow people did 2 things. And so it's a matter of thinking about how can we just get people on that spectrum of Leave No Trace, doing what they can to minimize their individual but cumulative impacts. That's really where we win. And that's what I'd like to leave you with today. So again, I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks so much for your time. And thanks for all you do for Leave No Trace.
Ben, thank you so much. A terrific presentation. It's always great to hear how good things are progressing with the Leave No Trace program. I am particularly encouraged by all the positive results of some of the research going on with respect to the efficacy of the program. We all want to know that what we're doing makes a difference, and it really is encouraging.